In lesson 2, I'm going to teach you about box shadows, and this is something that was often requested. So let's open up Google Chrome, and this is where we're starting off. Once again, we have a red box that's centered on the page, and here is our markup. So the only thing I want you to worry about is right down here where we will add a box shadow using the box shadow property. And this is going to accept a handful of parameters. The first one is going to be the X offset. So let's set it to a large value now so we can see it. The next one is going to be, what is the Y offset? We'll set that to 10 pixels as well. And the third parameter is going to be how much blur is going to be applied to this shadow. Once again, we'll apply 10 pixels. And finally, what is the color of this shadow? For now, I'm going to set it to black. And with that alone, I'm going to return to Chrome, and you'll see that we now have a rather intense shadow, something that I would never recommend, but it demonstrates exactly how each of these values work. So I'm going to set the browser and the editor side by side so that we can more easily work. Notice the 10 pixel value specifies left or right where we want this blur to be placed. Notice that the first value specifies left or right where the blur should be placed. In this case, we said essentially 10 pixels from the left. Now, if we were to make this a negative number, the blur is going to be placed on the other side. Reload, and now it's on this side. And the same thing for the y-axis. Right now, it's being pushed down 10 pixels, but if we make it negative, it's going to go up the y-axis by 10 pixels, as you can see like so. Next, we have the blur. And once again, we have 10 pixels. You can make that 50 pixels, and you can see the effect. How blurry is that shadow? And then finally, we have the color. You can set this to anything you want. If you wanted a terrible green shadow, for some reason, you could do it here. But now let's make it more realistic. I'm going to remove all of these, and let's say we want it 1 pixel to the right, 1 pixel down. We'll set 5 pixels of blur, and again, for now, I'm going to make the color black. And this is a little bit more common. If we zoom in, we can see that it's a very subtle shadow that's much more appealing, and it allows whatever your element is to pop off the page ever so slightly. But now the next issue is, if we think about it, a shadow is never pure black. Usually it's a level of black. So why don't we instead use RGBA? And this allows us to specify the red, green, blue, and alpha values. So if I set 0, 0, 0, that means no red, no green, no blue, which essentially gives us black. Now if I reload, we're not going to get anything, we just have hard black. Let's now set the alpha transparency. And if we set it to 1, that is fully visible. But if we set it to 0.5, that will give us more of a grayish color. Once again, I'll zoom in, and you can see we get more of a natural shadow. And you're free to play around with this to get exactly what you need. As you can see, that's much smarter than using such a hard black, which honestly isn't realistic. Now we can also pass an optional fourth parameter before specifying the color. So if I were to say 10 pixels, this would designate the spread. And now if I load, you can see we have 10 pixels all around for the spread, and then the shadow will occur. So to give you a better example of that, let's return that to full black. And now can you see if I zoom in, we have a black spread of 10 pixels, and then the actual blurring takes place. Now in this case, we don't need it, so I'm going to remove it, and now we can continue on. Next, we can stack our shadows. So if I were to put it on its own line, I can then create a comma-separated list. So for example, this time I'm going to set it 2 pixels to the right, 2 pixels down, 5 pixels worth of blur, and then I'm going to set the color to green. And now you can see that they have been stacked. We have our black shadow followed by the green shadow. So let's play around with it a bit more. And something that's quite common you'll find is to apply 0 blur. And this might seem odd for a shadow. You want blur, but you can get some interesting effects when you set the blur to 0. Now if I reload, can you see that we're getting a kind of a different stacking functionality? So right now, so we can easily see how it occurs, let's set the color to yellow. And now we have a yellow blur followed by green. Now, if I zoom out, what if we want this color right here to occur all the way around it rather than to the right and to the bottom? If we go right here, you can see to the left, there's nothing. So why don't we instead set 0 for the x-axis and 0 for the y-axis as well? And then we will use 1 pixel spread of yellow and 2 pixel spread of green. And now if I reload and I zoom in, can you see that we can use this technique to achieve double borders? So as you can see, once we have access to these CSS3 properties, we can use them in sort of unconventional ways to achieve different effects. Now, what's important to know is the spread is important here. If we were to set a 1 pixel spread of green, you would not be able to tell because now the green is underneath the yellow, because the higher up will take more precedence. So we have to add 1 pixel to each. If we wanted to apply another, we could do the exact same thing, but now I'm going to set 3 pixels and we'll set that to orange. Reload, and now you can see we can stack this as many times as possible, and this is one way to achieve multiple borders. Now, of course, you would never want to use these awful colors. You could do something much more subtle to make your designs pop. In the next lesson, I'm going to teach you about a service called Prefixer that allows us to keep from manually entering in all of the prefix-sized versions that we discussed in the previous lesson.